Imagine, if you will, the scent of fresh pressed olive oil. Not the refined, clear liquid you find in a modern supermarket, but the cloudy, green-gold fluid trickling from a stone press in ancient Athens. It smelled of earth, of sun-baked stone, and of the bitter, pungent flesh of the olive itself. To the ancient Greeks, this was more than just a culinary staple. It was the lifeblood of their economy, the very foundation of their daily existence. We talk of olive oil as a symbol of peace or health, but for the average Athenian farmer in the 5th century BC, it was a commodity of immense power and profound vulnerability. To understand the chaos of the olive oil price crash of 432 BC, you must first understand the central role of the oikos, the Greek household. The oikos was the primary unit of production and consumption. It wasn't just a home, it was a small, self-contained economic engine. The head of the oikos, the kyrios, was responsible for everything, from planting the crops to managing the slaves, from negotiating with merchants to ensuring the family's survival. And at the heart of nearly every oikos in Attica, the region surrounding Athens, stood the gnarled, ancient trunk of an olive tree. The olive tree was a long-term investment. It didn't yield its first significant crop for 10 to 15 years, and it wouldn't reach its full potential for decades. This meant that a farmer's prosperity was built on a foundation laid by their father and grandfather. It was a slow, deliberate form of capital accumulation, tied directly to the cycles of the seasons and the patience of generations. The very act of planting an olive tree was an act of faith in the future, a silent promise that you would be there to harvest its fruit, or that your children would. This inherent stability, however, also masked a deep fragility. The entire agricultural economy was based on a monoculture. If the olive crop failed, or if the price of olive oil plummeted, the entire system could, and did, come crashing down. For many, the olive tree was the sole source of significant wealth. Olive oil was used for everything: cooking, lighting lamps, anointing the body after exercise, and as a key export good. It was, in essence, the ancient equivalent of a multi-purpose resource. A successful harvest meant not just food on the table but also the ability to buy imported goods like grain from the Black Sea, which was a necessity, as Attica's soil was not ideal for wheat. A farmer might sell off a portion of his olive oil to a local merchant, who would then transport it in large ceramic amphorae to the bustling port of Piraeus. From there, it would be loaded onto ships bound for Egypt, Sicily, or the far reaches of the Black Sea. The logistics of this trade were, by modern standards, incredibly inefficient. Olive oil was heavy and bulky. Each amphora, a large two-handled jar, could hold around 25 to 30 liters. A ship could carry hundreds of these, but each one had to be meticulously packed and sealed to prevent leakage. The journey was slow and perilous, at the mercy of the winds and the dangers of piracy. The market was a complex web of small-scale producers, local middlemen, and large-scale merchants who operated on thin margins and the trust of their networks. There was no futures market, no instant communication to alert traders of a sudden glut of supply. Information traveled at the speed of a sailboat. In the years leading up to 432 BC, something unprecedented was happening across the Greek world. In the wake of the Persian Wars, a period of relative peace and prosperity had taken hold. Farmers, relieved from the threat of foreign invasion, had focused on expanding their groves. New settlements in places like the Chalcidice Peninsula and Sicily were also starting to produce large quantities of oil. This wasn't a coordinated effort, it was the result of thousands of individual farmers making the same rational decision to increase their olive production. The cumulative effect, however, was a slow-motion supply glut. Year after year, the harvest was good, and the amount of olive oil flooding the market grew. At first, the market absorbed it. Prices stayed relatively stable. The city of Athens, with its massive population, was a consistent consumer. But as the supply continued to outstrip demand, a subtle shift began to occur. A farmer who could once sell a full amphora for a good price found themselves having to sell it for less and less. For the small landholder, this was a catastrophe. They had planned their entire financial year around the expected revenue from their olive crop. A drop in price meant less money to buy grain, to pay off debts, or to afford the luxuries they had come to expect, like finely woven cloth or bronze tools. The delicate balance of their oikos was being thrown into disarray by a distant, unseen economic force. The city's leaders and large-scale merchants were slow to react. They were preoccupied with the rising political tensions between Athens and Sparta, the looming threat of the Peloponnesian War. The crisis on the farms was, to them, a minor inconvenience, a problem of supply and demand that would eventually correct itself. They didn't see the silent, spreading panic among the rural population, the quiet desperation as farmers looked at their olive groves, once a source of security, and saw a future of uncertainty. The political climate was so focused on military readiness that the mundane but crucial details of agricultural economics were simply overlooked. The stage was set for a perfect storm. A decade of overproduction, a slow and inefficient market for information, and a political elite distracted by the impending conflict with their rival city-state. All the small, seemingly insignificant details of daily life, the number of olive trees planted, the capacity of a trade ship, the slow journey of a messenger, were about to converge into a single, devastating event. But the final catalyst for the crash was something nobody could have predicted. It wasn't a crop failure or a military blockade. It was a seemingly innocuous piece of legislation, a law passed for a completely different purpose, that would finally tip the scales and bring the Athenian economy to its knees. What was this law, and how could a simple regulation concerning a minor trading partner have such a catastrophic effect on the entire Greek world? The seemingly innocuous piece of legislation that acted as the final catalyst for the olive oil price crash was the Megarian Decree. Passed by the Athenian Assembly in 432 BC, this decree was not aimed at the olive oil market directly. Its target was the small city-state of Megara, a rival of Athens situated on the Isthmus of Corinth. The political motive behind it was straightforward: to punish the Megarians for alleged sacrilegious acts on a piece of sacred land and for sheltering runaway slaves. The decree was an embargo, a complete ban on Megarian merchants from trading in any ports controlled by Athens, including the bustling hub of Piraeus. To the Athenian politicians, it was a symbolic act of power, a way to flex their naval and economic muscles. To the historian Thucydides, it was a major contributing factor, perhaps the single most important one, that ignited the Peloponnesian War. But to the hundreds of small-scale olive oil producers, it was a quiet, insidious blow to their livelihoods. How could a trade embargo on a single city-state, a minor player in the grand scheme of things, have such a devastating effect? The answer lies in the intricate and often overlooked logistics of ancient trade and the role of the Megarians within it. Megara, despite its small size, was a crucial intermediary. Its merchants were not just buyers, they were also highly efficient distributors. They had extensive networks that reached into areas where Athenian merchants did not. They served as vital middlemen, buying olive oil from Athens and Attica and then selling it to markets in the Peloponnese, in places like Corinth and Argos. They were also active in the northern Aegean and had trade relationships with Sicily and Italy. In essence, they were a capillary system for the Athenian economy, ensuring that the olive oil flowed from the producers to the wider Greek world. When the decree was passed, this capillary system was instantly severed. The Megarian merchants, who had a well-established and reliable demand for Athenian olive oil, suddenly stopped their purchases. This created a massive backlog. The producers in Attica, who had a decade's worth of bumper crops, now found their primary distribution channel completely blocked. The large Athenian merchants could absorb some of this excess supply, but they couldn't possibly replace the entire Megarian network. The glut of olive oil in Athens and its surrounding regions became a flood. The laws of supply and demand, as unyielding then as they are now, began their slow, brutal work. The price of olive oil, which had been slowly declining, went into a freefall. An amphora that might have sold for a solid price a year earlier was now fetching a fraction of that amount. This wasn't a temporary dip, it was a systemic collapse. The impact of this collapse was felt first and most acutely by the small-time farmers, the backbone of the Athenian agricultural economy. For them, there was no safety net. They lived on credit, on loans from wealthier citizens or temples, with the expectation that the next harvest would allow them to pay off their debts. The value of their crop, their primary collateral and source of income, had suddenly vanished. Many were unable to repay their loans. This led to a ripple effect of defaults and bankruptcies. The quiet, pastoral life of the Athenian countryside was consumed by a financial panic. Wealthy Athenians, who had invested heavily in land and olive groves, also felt the sting. The value of their assets plummeted. However, they had other sources of income, shipping, mining, urban rents, that allowed them to weather the storm. For the small farmer, the olive tree was everything. Their entire family's existence was tied to its health and productivity. When the price of its product collapsed, so did their world. The crisis was not just economic, it was deeply personal. It shattered the very foundation of the oikos, the household unit that had been the basis of Greek society for centuries. The political consequences were immediate. The farmers, who were a significant voting bloc in the Athenian assembly, were furious. They saw the Megarian decree as a short-sighted political move that had sacrificed their economic well-being for a point of pride. They had no interest in abstract political rivalries, they were concerned with putting food on the table. The anger of the rural population fueled the growing anti-war faction in Athens. The war hawks, led by Pericles, argued that the crisis was a minor issue that would be resolved once they had a swift victory over Sparta and its allies. But for the farmers, the crisis was no longer theoretical. It was a lived reality of poverty and debt. The economic crisis also revealed the hidden weaknesses of the Athenian Empire. The empire's wealth and power were not built on the gold and silver of its treasury alone, they were built on the productive capacity of its agricultural hinterland. The crisis exposed the fragility of this foundation. The reliance on a single major crop and the lack of a sophisticated financial system to buffer against price shocks meant that a seemingly minor political decision could trigger a widespread economic disaster. The story of the Megarian decree and the olive oil crash is a powerful lesson in unintended consequences, a testament to how complex systems, be they ecological, political, or economic, can be profoundly disrupted by a single, seemingly small change. The ripple effects didn't stop at the Athenian countryside. Megara, now cut off from its primary source of income, was desperate. It turned to its allies, most notably Sparta, for help. The Spartans saw this as a clear act of Athenian aggression and a violation of the treaties that were meant to maintain peace. The Megarian decree became a central point of contention in the diplomatic negotiations that were already underway between Athens and Sparta. Sparta, in a final attempt to avert war, sent an ultimatum to Athens, demanding, among other things, that the decree be rescinded. But Athens refused. The economic crisis had hardened the positions of both sides, making compromise impossible. The farmers of Attica, their livelihoods in ruins, looked on as their economic despair became a direct cause for war. What would happen when the conflict finally broke out, and how would this war, now triggered in part by a simple commodity, change the very landscape of the olive groves that had started it all? The olive groves that had long represented stability and prosperity for the Athenian countryside were about to become a theater of war. When the Peloponnesian War finally broke out in 431 BC, the agricultural landscape that had produced the great olive oil glut was immediately thrown into chaos. Sparta, a land-based military power, had one primary strategy for attacking Athens, invading Attica and destroying the enemy's agricultural heartland. The Spartans marched into the Athenian countryside, not with the goal of capturing the city, which was protected by its formidable long walls, but to systematically burn the olive groves, the vineyards, and the fields of grain. For the Athenian farmers, who had already been reeling from the economic collapse, this was the final, devastating blow. They were forced to abandon their farms and retreat within the safety of the city walls. This urban migration was a core part of Pericles' war strategy. He gambled that Athens could endure a prolonged siege by relying on its naval power to import food and supplies from its vast empire. But this strategy required the rural population to abandon their homes and livelihoods, to give up the very olive trees that had sustained their families for generations. The farmers who had once lived a relatively independent existence were now crowded into the city, living in makeshift shelters between the long walls. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and the constant anxiety of a besieged population. Their olive groves, which had been the source of their wealth and their crisis, were now just a distant memory, a smoke-filled landscape they could only imagine. The Spartans, in their yearly invasions, ensured that no crop was left to be harvested. They methodically destroyed the very foundation of the Athenian economy, turning a financial crisis into a humanitarian disaster. The olive oil price crash of 432 BC, which had been a crisis of oversupply, was now a crisis of absolute scarcity. The olive groves were gone. The price of olive oil, once a source of anxiety because it was too low, now skyrocketed, but there was nothing to buy. The Athenians, accustomed to a life rich in olive oil for cooking, lighting, and hygiene, were now forced to do without. The shortage contributed to the general hardship within the city, a quiet, mundane misery that went hand in hand with the grander tragedy of war. The war lasted for 27 years, and by its end, the landscape of Attica was a desolate ruin. The once thriving olive groves were gone, their ancient roots either burned or left to wither from neglect. The small-time farmers, those who survived the plague and the years of siege, had nothing to return to. Their land was worthless, their capital gone, and the future they had planned for their children had vanished. The economic foundation of the oikos had been permanently shattered. The long-term effects of this crisis were profound. The war and the destruction of the agricultural heartland led to a massive shift in the Athenian economy. The focus moved away from small-scale farming and more toward trade, commerce, and intellectual pursuits. Many of the displaced farmers, now landless and impoverished, had to find new ways to survive. Some joined the Athenian navy, others became laborers or craftsmen. The social structure of Athens, once built on the foundation of the rural landowner, began to transform. The great landholders, who had diversified their wealth, were able to recover, but the small-time farmers were left behind, their way of life a relic of a bygone era. The Megarian decree and the resulting olive oil price crash served as a microcosm of how small, seemingly insignificant decisions and overlooked details can have catastrophic, cascading effects. The Athenian leaders, consumed with their political and military rivalry with Sparta, failed to see how a simple trade embargo could ripple through their economy, destabilize their rural population, and ultimately become a direct cause for a war that would reshape the entire Greek world. The story of the olive groves is a testament to the fact that history is not just made by great battles and heroic speeches but by the mundane realities of daily life, the price of a single amphora of olive oil, the health of an ancient tree, and the silent desperation of a farmer watching his life's work go up in smoke. Ultimately, the crisis and the war it helped ignite led to the end of a golden age for Athens. The empire, its resources exhausted and its population decimated by war and plague, fell to Sparta. The economic and social order that had been in place for centuries was permanently altered. The farmers never fully recovered. The memory of the great olive oil crisis faded into the larger, more dramatic narrative of the Peloponnesian War, a hidden fact of history that reminds us that the seemingly boring details of supply, demand, and logistics can have more power to shape the world than any king or general. It shows us that even in ancient times, the global economy was a delicate, interconnected web, and a single thread, when pulled too hard, can unravel the entire tapestry. When you stand before the towering, graceful arches of a Roman aqueduct, you see a testament to engineering prowess. You see the grandeur of an empire, the triumph of human will over nature. But what you don't see, what is easily forgotten, are the thousands of quiet, mundane details that kept that water flowing. You don't see the silent army of civil servants, the endless ledgers, and the daily grind of maintenance that was as crucial to Rome's survival as any legionnaire's sword. The Roman aqueduct system was a logistical marvel, but its true genius lay not in its construction, but in its continuous, almost obsessive upkeep. The story begins with Rome's first aqueduct, the Aqua Appia, built in 312 BC. This wasn't a soaring structure of arches, it was an underground channel, a 16-kilometer tunnel dug through solid rock and soil, a hidden vein of fresh water running directly into the city. Its construction was a feat of sheer labor and coordination, but the true challenge came afterward. How do you keep a subterranean channel from collapsing? How do you prevent it from being clogged with silt and debris? How do you ensure a constant, clean flow of water to a city whose population was growing exponentially? The answer was bureaucracy. A special class of civil servants, known as the curators aquarum, or curators of the waters, were established. These were not glamorous positions. They were filled by men who understood numbers, who could manage labor crews, and who possessed a deep, almost fanatical attention to detail. Their job was to oversee every aspect of the aqueduct's operation, from the mountain spring where the water was sourced to the public fountain where it emerged in the heart of Rome. Their work was a constant battle against the forces of nature and time. Silt, carried by the water from the springs, would accumulate in the channels, reducing the flow. Tree roots would crack the clay pipes. In the city, a private citizen might illegally tap into a public line to divert water to their own home. It was a constant war of attrition, and the curators aquarum and their teams of surveyors and maintenance workers were on the front lines. They had to be vigilant, meticulously inspecting every section of the aqueduct, both above and below ground, for signs of trouble. The record-keeping was as detailed as the engineering. The head of the department, Sextus Julius Frontinus, who served as a curator in the 1st century AD, wrote a treatise on the aqueducts called De Aquis Urbis Romi. It wasn't a philosophical work or a dramatic history, it was a dry, technical manual, a meticulous log of every aqueduct's length, capacity, and repair history. Frontinus was a true bureaucrat at heart. He was obsessed with efficiency, with eliminating waste, and with ensuring that every last drop of water was accounted for. He railed against the private citizens who illegally siphoned water from the main lines, a practice he considered a form of theft against the public good. The water was carefully measured using an ingenious system of standardized nozzles, or calices, which ensured that the correct amount of water was dispensed to each user, whether a public bath, a private household, or a public fountain. This system of measurement, however, was also a source of constant fraud. A crafty plumber might replace a standard nozzle with a larger one, or a homeowner might illegally add another connection. Frontinus and his team were constantly on the lookout for such violations, and they would impose stiff fines on those caught. The maintenance crews, often composed of slaves and freedmen, were the unsung heroes of this system. They were the ones who descended into the dark, damp tunnels to chip away the mineral deposits that lined the walls of the channels. They were the ones who repaired the cracked pipes, cemented the leaky joints, and cleared the blockages. Their work was physically demanding and often dangerous, but it was essential. Without them, the entire system would have ground to a halt. The aqueducts were not just a feat of engineering, they were a complex social and economic network. The flow of water dictated where people lived, how they bathed, and what their daily lives looked like. The success of this system was a direct result of the Roman obsession with order and efficiency. They understood that a grand monument was useless without a sound, boring, and utterly meticulous plan for its upkeep. But as the empire grew, so too did the complexity of the aqueduct system. The demands of a sprawling metropolis meant more aqueducts had to be built, and the maintenance bureaucracy had to expand to manage them. As the system became more spread out and complicated, so did the problems. How could a centralized bureaucracy in Rome possibly keep track of every leak and every illegal tap-in across hundreds of kilometers of aqueducts? The very success of their engineering was about to create a logistical problem of unprecedented scale, a problem that even the most meticulous Roman bureaucrat could not have foreseen. How would the curators aquarum adapt to this new challenge, and what happens when the very infrastructure of an empire becomes too unwieldy to manage? The expansion of Rome's aqueduct system was a testament to its success, but it also created a new class of problems, a mundane but relentless battle against entropy and human nature. The curators aquarum had their work cut out for them. With 11 major aqueducts crisscrossing the landscape, carrying water over hundreds of kilometers, the sheer scale of the system made centralized management a logistical nightmare. The question of how to keep track of every leak, every illegal tap, and every required repair was no longer just a matter of diligence, it became a problem of effective bureaucracy and remote oversight. One of the greatest enemies of the aqueduct was the leak. A small fissure in a lead pipe or a hairline crack in a concrete channel could, over time, lead to a massive loss of water. The Roman engineers had developed a special type of hydraulic cement, a mixture of lime and volcanic sand, to make their channels waterproof, but no material is immune to the forces of time and pressure. The curator's aquarum had to deploy small, mobile teams of plumbarii, lead workers, and masons to constantly patrol the aqueduct's route. These teams would follow the aqueduct, looking for signs of seepage on the ground, or listening for the telltale hiss of a leak. It was a tedious, never-ending task, often conducted in remote, forested areas far from the city. The cost of this constant vigilance was enormous, both in labor and materials, and it accounted for a significant portion of the city's public budget. Equally problematic was the issue of illegal water diversion. The Romans had a system for distributing water to private households, but it was rife with corruption. A wealthy citizen might bribe a local water official to install an unmetered pipe, or a conniving plumber might surreptitiously run a line from a public fountain to a private villa. Frontinus, in his treatise, meticulously documented these abuses. He called them theft and argued that they were a public crime, stealing from the very citizens who relied on the water for their health and well-being. He was particularly incensed by the practice of connecting a pipe directly to the main aqueduct line, which not only stole water but also reduced the pressure for everyone downstream. To combat this, the bureaucracy employed a system of public inspection. Officials would periodically survey the city's plumbing, looking for unauthorized connections. They would check the size of the lead pipes, which were stamped with the name of the emperor and the size of the orifice, to ensure no one had illegally upsized their connection. They also kept meticulous records of every legal water connection, every calyx, and the amount of water each was permitted to draw. This system, while not foolproof, was a remarkable early attempt at a centralized public utility management system. The sheer scale of the system meant that the management of the curator's aquarum had to be decentralized. Regional offices were established along the aqueduct's route, each with its own staff of engineers, foremen, and laborers. This created a new layer of bureaucracy and with it, new problems. Communication was slow. A leak discovered 50 miles away had to be reported up the chain of command, a process that could take days. The local officials, far from the watchful eye of the main office in Rome, were more susceptible to corruption. A local Aquarius might look the other way for a small bribe, allowing a wealthy landowner to run an illegal line to their fields. The Roman solution was to build more aqueducts, to try and stay one step ahead of the problem. They believed that by creating a redundancy of supply, they could absorb the losses from leaks and fraud. But this only compounded the problem. Each new aqueduct required more maintenance, more inspections, and more paperwork. The bureaucracy grew, becoming slower and more ponderous. The elegant engineering of the aqueducts was matched by an increasingly cumbersome administrative machine. The story of Rome's aqueducts is a powerful reminder that the grandest of human achievements are often dependent on the most boring and detailed of tasks. A magnificent aqueduct could be rendered useless not by a barbarian invasion or an earthquake, but by a clogged pipe and a corrupt clerk. The very success of the aqueduct system was creating its own downfall. The city of Rome became addicted to a constant, reliable flow of water. The daily life of its citizens, from the public baths to the sanitation systems, was utterly dependent on the aqueduct's perfect operation. But as the system grew, so did its vulnerability. What would happen when the bureaucracy became so overwhelmed that it could no longer keep up with the demands of maintenance? What happens when the engineers and the administrators, the quiet guardians of the city's lifeblood, finally lose their battle against the slow, grinding forces of decay? The slow decay of the Roman aqueduct system was not the result of a single catastrophic event, but rather a long, grinding process of neglect and logistical failure. As the empire entered its twilight years, the resources and manpower required to maintain the vast aqueduct system began to dwindle. The problem was no longer one of inefficiency, but one of sheer financial and administrative impossibility. The meticulous records of Frontinus became historical artifacts, and the legions of plumbarii and masons became fewer and farther between. The battle against entropy was finally being lost. The signs of decline were subtle at first. A small, unnoticed leak in a rural channel would slowly erode the ground, until a section of the aqueduct's channel collapsed. An illegal tap-in, once a minor annoyance, became commonplace. As the centralized authority of Rome weakened, local officials and powerful landowners took matters into their own hands, diverting water to their own villas and estates with impunity. The public baths and fountains, once a symbol of Rome's grandeur, began to run dry. The system was failing from the outside in, slowly losing its coherence and functionality. The final, decisive blow to the aqueducts came not from war, but from the simple, unglamorous reality of changing priorities. As the Western Roman Empire fragmented, the new rulers of Italy and the surrounding territories had no interest in maintaining a complex, expensive system designed for a city of over 1 million people. The Goths, the Vandals, and the other migrating tribes were not engineers, they were warriors and administrators of a different kind. The aqueducts were too complex, too demanding of a centralized bureaucracy to be useful to them. Some were intentionally sabotaged during sieges, but most were simply allowed to crumble. The stone arches, once so majestic, became quarries for new buildings. The lead pipes were melted down for new uses. The story of the Roman aqueduct's decline is a powerful lesson in how the grandest of human achievements can be undone by the most mundane of forces: a lack of funding, a shift in political focus, and a failure to maintain the unglamorous but essential bureaucracy that keeps a complex system running. It reveals that infrastructure is not a static object, but a living, breathing system that requires constant care and attention. Today, the remnants of the aqueducts stand as silent monuments, their cracked stone and eroded channels a testament to a lost civilization. But their legacy is not just in the ruins. The principles of Roman water management, the use of gravity, the reliance on a public water supply, and the concept of a dedicated maintenance force, have had a lasting impact on civil engineering. The very idea of a public utility, a service provided by a central authority for the benefit of all citizens, has its roots in the boring, meticulous work of the curators aquarum. In a way, the Roman aqueduct system's failure in the West led to a strange and unexpected outcome: the decentralization of water management. In the centuries that followed, European cities and towns had to rely on wells and local water sources, a far cry from the grand public works of Rome. It was not until the 19th century that engineers, inspired by the surviving Roman models, began to build centralized water systems again. The lessons of the Aqua Appia and the Aqua Claudia, that a system is only as strong as its weakest point and that the most impressive engineering feat is nothing without the boring, endless work of maintenance, are still incredibly relevant today. The silent, meticulous work of the Roman water bureaucrats laid the foundation for the complex, hidden networks that bring clean water to our taps today. When we think of the Silk Road, we often conjure images of dusty caravans, exotic spices, and brave merchants traversing vast, unforgiving deserts. We imagine a romantic, lawless frontier where fortunes were made and lost at the whims of bandits and sandstorms. But this romantic image, while compelling, completely misses the most crucial, and most boring, part of the story: the bureaucracy. The Silk Road was not a lawless wilderness, it was a complex, highly regulated network of trade, and its lifeblood was not silk, but paper. For centuries, this vast exchange of goods, ideas, and cultures was made possible by a quiet, unseen army of clerks, scribes, and local officials. Their work was the logistical glue that held the entire system together. Without them, the vast network of trade would have collapsed into a disorganized mess of broken trusts and lost goods. The journey of a single bolt of silk from Chanaan to Antioch was not a dramatic sprint, but a slow, methodical relay race, governed by documents, tariffs, and meticulous record-keeping. The journey began in the bureaucratic heart of the Han dynasty. A merchant, before they could even load their goods, had to secure a license to travel and trade. This was not a simple piece of paper. It was a multi-part document detailing the merchant's name, the goods they were carrying, their intended destination, and the route they planned to take. This was a crucial first step, as it legitimized the merchant and his cargo in the eyes of the many local authorities they would encounter. The document was a passport for goods, a guarantee that this particular caravan was not a group of bandits but a legitimate trading enterprise. As the caravan moved westward, it would pass through a series of fortified checkpoints and customs stations. At each of these, the merchant had to present their papers. A local official would inspect the cargo, verify the documents, and levy a tariff. These checkpoints, often located at key mountain passes or at the entrance to oases, were not just for security, they were the nerve centers of the Silk Road bureaucracy. Here, scribes would painstakingly record the details of each passing caravan in large, leather-bound ledgers. They would note the type of goods, the quantity, and the amount of tax collected. This information was crucial for both the central government, which needed to track its revenue, and for the local officials, who could use the data to monitor trade flows and even forecast future market demands. The records from these checkpoints, many of which have been unearthed by archaeologists in places like Dunhuang and along the Gansu corridor, paint a picture of an incredibly sophisticated administrative system. We have found wooden tablets and paper scrolls detailing the names of merchants, the number of camels in a caravan, and the specific duties paid on goods as mundane as felt, wool, and even dried fruit. It's a treasure trove of bureaucratic detail, a testament to the fact that the romance of the Silk Road was built on the foundation of the profoundly unromantic reality of taxation and paperwork. The paperwork served another critical function: dispute resolution. When a merchant's goods were stolen or damaged, the documents they carried served as proof of ownership and value. They could present these to a local magistrate, who would use the records from the customs stations to verify their story and attempt to recover the lost goods. This system, while imperfect, provided a degree of legal security that was essential for long-distance trade. Merchants, knowing that there was a system in place to protect their interests, were more willing to risk their capital on these perilous journeys. The bureaucrats of the Silk Road were the unseen agents of stability. They were the ones who ensured that a merchant who left Chang'an with 100 bolts of silk could reasonably expect that they would have 100 bolts of silk to sell in Palmyra, minus the predictable tariffs. They were the ones who managed the infrastructure, who kept the supply lines open, and who, through the boring process of data entry, facilitated one of the greatest periods of cultural exchange in human history. The system was a marvel of logistics, but its very success sowed the seeds of its own downfall. As the empires at either end of the route, the Han and the Romans, began to weaken, their centralized bureaucracies began to fray. What happens when the administrative glue that holds a global trade network together begins to fail, and how does the decline of a far-off empire affect a lone merchant on a camel in the middle of a vast desert? The decline of the Silk Road was a gradual process, a slow unspooling that began not with a dramatic collapse, but with the quiet decay of its administrative core. As the great empires at the ends of the trade routes, the Han in the east and the Romans in the west, began to weaken from internal strife and external pressures, their ability to maintain the bureaucratic infrastructure of the Silk Road diminished. The effect was a slow erosion of trust, the most valuable currency on the Silk Road. The meticulous record-keeping in customs stations, once a symbol of state authority and stability, became less reliable. An official might no longer have the resources to properly inspect a caravan or to send a dispatch to the next checkpoint. This created an environment where corruption could flourish. Local officials, no longer held accountable by a strong central government, could demand higher tariffs or outright bribes. This raised the cost of doing business, making long-distance trade less profitable for the average merchant. Moreover, the decline of centralized power meant a rise in regional fragmentation. The Silk Road was not a single highway but a network of overlapping routes, each managed by local powers. As the great empires receded, new, smaller kingdoms and tribes emerged. Each of these new entities had its own customs, its own tariffs, and its own set of rules. A merchant who once needed a single license to travel from Chang'an to the edge of the Roman world might now need to negotiate with a dozen different minor rulers. This patchwork of regulations created a logistical nightmare. This administrative chaos also led to a breakdown in the system of dispute resolution. When a merchant's goods were stolen, there was no longer a reliable magistrate to turn to. The legal security that had been provided by the empires was gone. This forced merchants to rely on personal networks and tribal allegiances for protection. The system of trade shifted from one based on official, bureaucratic records to one based on personal relationships and private agreements. A merchant would travel with armed guards and rely on the protection of a powerful local chieftain rather than the authority of a distant emperor. The consequences were a fundamental shift in the nature of trade. The large-scale, impersonal commerce of the Roman and Han eras gave way to smaller, more localized trade. Merchants began to specialize in shorter routes, acting as intermediaries in a series of smaller transactions. A merchant might only travel from one oasis to the next, selling his goods to another merchant who would continue the journey. This relay trade was less efficient and more costly, but it was the only way to mitigate the risks of a system without a central authority. The decline of the Silk Road bureaucracy was not just a story of administrative failure, it was a story of human ingenuity in the face of chaos. As the written records and state protections vanished, merchants and caravan leaders created new ways to manage risk. They formed trade guilds and associations, private organizations that provided mutual protection and a system of internal arbitration. These guilds were the unseen, unofficial replacements for the failing state bureaucracy. They created their own rules, their own system of credit, and their own methods for resolving disputes. The story of the Silk Road's decline is a testament to how profoundly a global system can be dependent on the most mundane of details. It was not the dramatic fall of an empire, but the slow, unglamorous failure of its paperwork that brought one of the greatest networks of trade and cultural exchange to its knees. The loss of a reliable system of official documents and record-keeping made a world once connected by trade into a fragmented collection of local markets. What happened when the silk itself could no longer flow freely, and how did this loss of connection change the very nature of the civilizations that had relied on it for centuries? The fragmentation of the Silk Road bureaucracy had a profound and lasting impact. With the major empires no longer guaranteeing the safety and reliability of long-distance trade, the flow of goods and ideas that had once moved freely between East and West slowed to a trickle. The vast quantities of silk, spices, and exotic goods that had once defined the Roman and Han economies became scarce. This scarcity had a ripple effect, changing everything from fashion and cuisine to politics. Roman elites, who had once prided themselves on their silk garments, had to turn to local alternatives like wool and linen. The taste for exotic spices, once a symbol of wealth, became a distant memory. The entire economic and cultural landscape of the Eurasian continent was shifting, and it was all because a handful of anonymous clerks could no longer do their jobs effectively. The decline of the Silk Road didn't mean that trade stopped altogether. Instead, it was replaced by a series of smaller, more localized networks. The trans-Saharan trade routes became more prominent, bringing gold, salt, and enslaved people from West Africa to the Mediterranean. The Indian Ocean trade network, which had always existed, expanded to fill the void left by the Silk Road. Arab, Indian, and Chinese merchants created a thriving maritime system, using monsoon winds to carry goods between East Africa, the Middle East, India, and Southeast Asia. These new networks were not a perfect replacement. They had their own logistical challenges, from the dangers of the open sea to the complexities of inter-regional politics. But they proved that human ingenuity, once again, could adapt to the failures of an old system. The rise of these new networks proved that while empires and their bureaucracies could fail, the human desire for trade and connection was inextinguishable. The maritime routes were, in many ways, more efficient than the overland Silk Road. Ships could carry much larger quantities of goods than a caravan of camels, and the cost per unit was significantly lower. This shift from land to sea was a quiet revolution, one that would eventually lead to the Great Age of Exploration. The legacy of the Silk Road bureaucrats was not just in their failure, but in the lessons learned from that failure. It showed future generations that a stable trade network required more than just a route, it required a system of trust, a means of dispute resolution, and a reliable way to manage the flow of goods. The Silk Road, in its classical form, was never truly revived. The Mongol Empire, centuries later, would briefly create a new kind of unified, secure trade network, but it was a temporary phenomenon. The future of global trade belonged to the oceans. But the story of the unseen bureaucrats and their paperwork is a crucial one. It reminds us that the grand narratives of history, the rise and fall of empires, the clash of cultures, are often built on the most mundane of foundations. The slow, boring work of clerks and scribes, the endless process of tallying taxes and stamping documents, was what held the ancient world together. When that work stopped, the world, in a very real sense, began to fall apart. It shows us that the hidden heroes of history are often not the ones who make war, but the ones who make commerce possible, one piece of paper at a time. When you envision a Roman road, you likely picture a perfectly straight, meticulously paved artery of stone and gravel stretching to the horizon. These roads, a marvel of ancient engineering, were the veins of the Roman Empire, allowing legions, administrators, and merchants to move with astonishing speed. But the true genius of the Roman road network wasn't just in its construction, it was in the system that made it usable for every traveler. At every major junction, every city gate, and every mile marker, stood the humble, unglamorous milestone, the unseen wayfinder of the ancient world. The milestone, or millenarium, was far more than a simple marker of distance. It was a piece of the Roman state, a small, boring monument to imperial order and communication. These columns of stone, typically standing a few meters tall, were erected by the central government or by local magistrates. They were not just for show, they were a vital part of the Roman logistical machine. Each milestone was meticulously carved with an inscription detailing the distance to the nearest major city, the name of the emperor who commissioned or repaired the road, and sometimes a brief dedication to a deity. For a traveler, these were not just markers, they were a roadmap, a silent promise of the road's destination and the empire's reach. The responsibility for these milestones fell to a dedicated, if uncelebrated, group of Roman officials and civil servants. It was their job to ensure that every road was properly marked and that the information was accurate. The task was not just about carving stone, it was about maintaining a vast, interconnected network of information. A faulty milestone could send a legion in the wrong direction or a merchant on a costly detour. The accuracy of the milestones was a matter of public safety and economic efficiency. A traveler, whether a soldier on a forced march or a merchant carrying a load of goods, relied on these stones to know where they were and how far they had to go. The inscriptions on these milestones also served a crucial political purpose. They were a form of ancient propaganda, a constant, physical reminder of the emperor's power and beneficence. By including the name of the reigning emperor, the milestones linked the maintenance of the roads directly to the health and stability of the state. It was a message that a traveler could read in every corner of the empire, from the windswept moors of Britannia to the sun-baked deserts of Syria. The emperor was everywhere, his authority and care manifested in the stone beneath your feet and the marker beside the road. The system of road maintenance and milestone upkeep was a marvel of organization. Engineers and work crews, often comprised of soldiers or state slaves, were constantly tasked with repairing sections of road and replacing damaged or illegible milestones. They would use local stone, carve the necessary inscriptions, and set them into the ground with the precision of a trained surveyor. The work was repetitive, physically demanding, and far from glamorous. It was the kind of work that is easily forgotten in the grander narratives of history, yet without it, the empire's grand military campaigns and commercial ventures would have been impossible. But as the empire grew and stretched its resources thin, the maintenance of this network became an increasingly difficult logistical challenge. The cost of carving and transporting thousands of stone pillars was immense. The manpower needed to maintain them was a drain on the imperial treasury. The very success of the road network was about to create a problem that the Roman state, in its twilight years, would be unable to solve. The vastness of the network, once a source of strength, was becoming a source of vulnerability. What happens when the empire's ability to maintain its physical infrastructure, and the silent wayfinding system that supported it, begins to fail? What happens when a traveler can no longer trust the stone beside the road? And how does that change the very nature of travel and communication in the ancient world? The long, slow demise of Roman road signage was a silent and largely unrecorded process. It was not a sudden act of destruction, but a gradual, quiet failure of the system. As the empire's resources became increasingly strained, the first thing to go was the maintenance budget for the roads. The grand legions and the central government had bigger problems to worry about: barbarian invasions, internal coups, and economic collapse. The painstaking work of repairing roads and replacing milestones, once a point of imperial pride, was now seen as a wasteful luxury. The most visible sign of this decay was the failing milestones. The weather, time, and human neglect began to take their toll. Inscriptions, once sharp and clear, faded and became illegible. Stones were knocked over by accident or, in some cases, intentionally vandalized. A traveler could no longer be certain that the distance marked on the stone was accurate, or that the stone itself was even in its original location. The once reliable roadmap of the empire became a confusing, unreliable mess. This lack of certainty had real-world consequences. A merchant could lose valuable time and money on a wrong turn. A courier carrying an urgent message could get lost, causing a critical delay in a military campaign or a political decision. The entire system of imperial communication, which relied on the speed and reliability of the roads, began to unravel from the ground up. This decline was also a story of decentralization. As the central authority in Rome weakened, local magistrates and officials took over the task of road maintenance, but they often lacked the resources, technical knowledge, or incentive to do the job properly. A local official might only care about the road that ran through their own territory, neglecting the sections that connected to other regions. The seamless, interconnected network of the High Empire was becoming a patchwork of disconnected local roads. The standards of construction and maintenance, once uniform across the empire, became wildly inconsistent. A traveler could go from a well-maintained road to a rutted, impassable track in a matter of miles. The disappearance of the emperor's name from the milestones was a subtle but profound signal of this shift. In the early empire, every new road and every repaired section was an opportunity to praise the reigning ruler. But as the empire declined, new milestones were either not erected at all, or their inscriptions were simple, generic markers without any imperial dedication. The message was clear: the central government no longer had the resources or the authority to manage its most fundamental infrastructure. The roads, and the milestones that marked them, were becoming a matter of local concern, not imperial policy. The decline of Roman road signage was a physical manifestation of a deeper, more systemic problem. It was a tangible sign of the empire's inability to govern itself effectively and to maintain the core functions of state. The empire was not just falling from foreign attacks, it was slowly crumbling from within, losing its coherence and its ability to provide the basic public services that had once been its hallmark. The silent erasure of the milestones was a prelude to the end of an era. What would happen when the roads themselves, and the knowledge of how to build and maintain them, were also forgotten? The very memory of how to create such a vast, interconnected network was fading, a quiet, unglamorous end to one of history's great achievements. The final, unglamorous end of the Roman road signage system was a reflection of the larger collapse of Western Roman civilization. The stones, once a symbol of imperial authority, became a new kind of resource. As the Roman state receded, local populations, in need of building materials, began to take the stones for their own uses. Milestones were repurposed as doorsteps, gateposts, or building foundations. The very thing that had guided travelers for centuries was being recycled into the mundane architecture of a new, fragmented world. This was not a moment of dramatic rebellion, it was a slow, practical scavenging of a dead system. The knowledge of how to read the inscriptions, once a widespread skill, faded. The roads themselves, without a centralized maintenance system, fell into disrepair, becoming little more than overgrown paths and muddy tracks. This decay had a profound effect on the nature of post-Roman society. With the roads no longer safe or reliable, long-distance travel became far more perilous and rare. The great trading networks that had connected the empire were severed. Trade became localized, and the vibrant exchange of goods and ideas that had characterized the Roman world came to an end. The economy of Western Europe became agrarian and insular. A merchant could no longer travel from Gaul to Italy with any certainty. Instead, they relied on local markets and smaller-scale, regional trade. The very concept of a long, interconnected road trip vanished from the cultural consciousness for centuries. The decline of the road network also had a significant impact on military and political power. An emperor could no longer move legions quickly and efficiently to quell a rebellion or defend a border. The speed of communication slowed to a crawl. The ability to project centralized power over vast distances was lost, paving the way for the feudal system, where local lords, not a distant emperor, held sway. The power of a lord was measured not by his connection to a grand imperial network, but by his control over a small, defensible piece of land. The physical reality of the broken roads mirrored the political fragmentation of the continent. The legacy of the Roman road signage is not in its survival, but in its failure. It teaches us a crucial lesson, that even the most impressive feats of engineering are only as good as the system that maintains them. The grand arches and perfectly straight lines of the Roman roads are what we remember, but their true genius lay in the boring, bureaucratic work of the officials who placed the milestones and the laborers who kept them standing. When that system failed, the entire network, and the civilization it supported, began to unravel. Today, we take for granted the intricate and unseen networks of our modern world, the GPS satellites, the electrical grids, the fiber optic cables, but the story of the Roman milestones is a quiet, powerful reminder that all grand systems are utterly dependent on the mundane details of their upkeep. It shows us that a civilization's most lasting achievement is not always its creation, but its ability to sustain what it has built. When we think of the great ancient civilizations, we often focus on their monumental achievements, the pyramids of Egypt, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the philosophies of Greece. But behind every one of these grand accomplishments was a quiet, persistent force of organization, accounting. The history of civilization itself is, in many ways, the history of bureaucracy and numbers, and it all began in the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia with the Sumerians, a people obsessed with counting things. The story of accounting begins not with a king or a conqueror, but with a humble grain of barley. The earliest forms of writing were not for poetry or epic tales, but for keeping track of what was coming in and what was going out of the temple granaries. In Sumerian society, the temple was the central economic institution. It was the largest landowner, the largest employer, and the largest bank. Farmers would bring their harvest, barley, wheat, dates, to the temple as a form of tax or tithe. The priests, in turn, would redistribute these goods to the laborers and craftsmen who worked for the temple. But how did they keep track of who had given what, and who was owed what? The solution was a system of remarkable, if boring, ingenuity. The Sumerians developed a system of clay tokens. Each token represented a specific commodity. A small clay sphere might represent a single sheep, while a cone might represent a measure of barley. These tokens were used as a form of receipt and record. When a farmer brought a portion of his harvest to the granary, a temple scribe would give him a specific number of tokens. When the farmer needed to withdraw grain later, he would present the tokens. It was a physical, tangible record of a debt or a credit. This system, however, had a major flaw: the tokens could be lost, stolen, or counterfeited. To solve this problem, the Sumerians invented the bulla, a hollow clay ball. When a transaction was made, the tokens were placed inside the bulla, and the exterior was sealed with a unique stamp, or cylinder seal, belonging to the scribe and the individuals involved. This created a secure, tamper-proof record of the transaction. If there was a dispute, the bulla could be broken, and the tokens inside would provide the definitive evidence of what had been exchanged. The bulla was a brilliant innovation, but it was still a cumbersome and inefficient system. To know what was inside, you had to break it, destroying the record. The next great leap in accounting was a simple one: why not just press the tokens into the soft clay on the outside of the bulla before sealing it? This created a visual record of the contents without having to break the ball. This seemingly small innovation was the birth of pictographic writing. The signs on the outside of the bulla were simplified representations of the tokens inside. A circle with a cross became a symbol for a sheep. A series of wedges represented a number. From there, it was a short, logical step to abandoning the tokens altogether. If you could press the symbols into a flat clay tablet, you no longer needed the tokens or the bulla. You could simply create a single, durable record of the transaction. This was the birth of cuneiform, one of the world's first writing systems. Cuneiform, which means wedge-shaped, was created by using a reed stylus to make impressions in soft clay. Its earliest purpose was purely for accounting, keeping track of grain, livestock, and labor. The Sumerian accountants, the first scribes, were the unsung heroes of this revolution. They sat in the temples and palace courtyards, surrounded by their clay tablets, meticulously recording every transaction. Their work, though repetitive and mundane, was the foundation of the Sumerian state. It allowed a complex, urban society to manage its resources, to levy taxes, to pay its workers, and to engage in large-scale public works projects like the building of ziggurats and irrigation canals. Without their boring, detailed records, the entire system would have collapsed into anarchy. This obsession with accounting was not just a side note of Sumerian history, it was the very engine that powered their civilization. But as society grew more complex, so did the financial system. How would the Sumerian simple system of counting sheep and barley adapt to a world of trade, contracts, and credit, and what happened when this boring new technology was used for things other than accounting? The Sumerian simple system of counting sheep and barley quickly adapted to the growing complexity of their society. As cities like Uruk and Ur grew, the need for more sophisticated financial instruments became apparent. The humble clay tablet, once a mere record of a single transaction, evolved into a tool for contracts, loans, and legal agreements. This was the second great revolution in accounting, moving it from a passive record-keeping system to an active tool of commerce and law. Merchants, instead of simply recording the sale of goods, began to use clay tablets to formalize agreements with their business partners. A tablet could be inscribed with the terms of a loan, the amount of silver borrowed, the interest rate, and the date of repayment. The tablet would be signed and sealed by both parties and a witness, creating a legally binding document. This system provided a level of certainty that had never existed before. It allowed merchants to conduct business with people they didn't know personally, secure in the knowledge that the agreement was legally enforceable. This enabled long-distance trade and the growth of a more complex economy. The trust that once relied on personal relationships was now codified in the boring, meticulous details of a clay tablet. The development of accounting also led to the birth of economic law. The world's first accountants, the scribes, were also the world's first lawyers. The same cuneiform script used to record a grain transaction was used to write down the laws of the land. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the most famous legal codes of the ancient world, was not a philosophical treatise. It was a practical, detailed set of rules for resolving disputes, many of which were financial in nature. It included laws about debt, inheritance, property ownership, and business partnerships. The very structure of the code, with its if-then format, if a man borrows money and cannot repay, then, is a testament to its origins in the logical, sequential thinking of accounting. The Sumerian obsession with counting and record-keeping also allowed for the creation of large-scale public works projects. The construction of a ziggurat or an irrigation canal required a massive mobilization of labor and resources. How did the priests and rulers ensure that thousands of workers were paid in the correct amount of barley? How did they keep track of the raw materials, the stone, the mud bricks, and the lumber? The answer was a bureaucracy built on clay tablets. The system of accounting allowed them to manage complex supply chains and payrolls, to track the hours worked by a laborer, and to ensure that the project was completed on budget, or at least that the budget's failures were meticulously documented. But this sophisticated system, a marvel of ancient bureaucracy, was still deeply fragile. It relied on a stable political order and a continuous supply of scribes trained in the difficult art of cuneiform. What happened when the state's power wavered? When the temples and palaces were sacked, and the administrative class was dispersed? The entire system, which had been built on a foundation of boring, detailed records, was susceptible to a sudden and unglamorous end. The technology of accounting was a double-edged sword. It allowed for immense complexity and power, but it also created a new kind of vulnerability. How would the legacy of Sumerian accounting survive the fall of its own civilization, and how would these mundane principles of counting and record-keeping reappear in a world that had forgotten how to read their elegant script? The collapse of the Sumerian and Akkadian empires did not mean the end of accounting. Instead, the principles of meticulous record-keeping, of using a system of notation to manage resources and contracts, were passed down and adapted by successive civilizations. The Babylonians, Assyrians, and later the Persians all built upon the foundations laid by the Sumerian scribes. The clay tablet gave way to papyrus and then to paper, but the fundamental concepts remained. The double-entry bookkeeping of a temple granary became the basis for the ledgers of an empire. The story of Sumerian accounting is not about its failure, but about how a simple, boring technology outlasted the very civilization that created it. The most profound and lasting legacy of Sumerian accounting was the very concept of written contracts. The idea that a debt, an agreement, or a law could be codified on a durable medium, and that this record could be used to resolve disputes, was a revolutionary concept. It allowed for the creation of complex, impersonal societies where trust was not based on personal relationships but on a shared system of law and record-keeping. This boring, bureaucratic invention was the engine of commerce for thousands of years, a direct line from the first clay tablets to the modern legal system. The Sumerian accountants also gave us the very idea of literacy for a practical purpose. The first schools were not for teaching poetry or history, but for training scribes in the art of cuneiform and mathematics. These schools were the first professional training programs, creating a class of specialists who were essential to the functioning of the state. This tradition of education, of training a class of experts to manage the logistics of a complex society, is a legacy that continues to this day. Ultimately, the fall of the Sumerian state did not erase their ideas. It scattered them. The knowledge of accounting, of numbers, and of written law was carried by merchants and scholars to other civilizations, where it was adapted and refined. The simple clay tokens and bola are a direct and tangible link to the complex financial systems we use today. The first accountants, sitting in the dusty temple courtyards of Mesopotamia, were not just counting grain, they were, in their own quiet and unglamorous way, laying the foundations for the entire history of commerce, law, and civilization itself. They showed us that the true power of an idea lies not in its grandeur, but in its ability to be useful, practical, and, most importantly, enduring. When you think of a medieval scribe, you might picture a wizened old monk hunched over a magnificent illuminated manuscript, painstakingly adding a touch of gold leaf to a miniature scene. This image, while not entirely wrong, is a romanticized fantasy that glosses over the profoundly mundane reality of their daily lives. The life of a medieval scribe was one of relentless, soul-crushing routine, where the greatest drama was often a misplaced comma or a run-in with a mouse. It was a life of cold, repetitive labor that was as far from artistic freedom as one could imagine. The day began not with inspiration, but with the bell. A scribe, often a monk living in a monastery, would rise before dawn. The first hours of the day were dedicated to prayer and devotion, but after that, it was straight to the scriptorium, the monastery's writing room. This was not a place of cozy comfort. Scriptoriums were often unheated, as a fire's smoke could damage the precious parchment. Scribes worked in frigid silence, their hands numb from the cold, the only sound the scratching of a quill on animal skin. It was a battle against the elements as much as it was a battle against tedium. The raw materials themselves were a constant source of friction. The writing surface was parchment, made from the treated skins of sheep, goats, or calves. Preparing a single sheet was a laborious process. The skin had to be cleaned, stretched, scraped, and smoothed, a smelly and physically demanding task. Then, the sheets had to be ruled with a sharp tool, creating faint, precise lines to guide the writing. A single mistake could ruin a sheet, and a single sheet could represent days of work. The tools of the trade were just as unforgiving. The primary writing tool was a quill pen, typically made from a goose feather. A scribe had to constantly sharpen the tip with a small knife, a delicate procedure that, if done incorrectly, could ruin the pen. The ink, made from lampblack, oak galls, or other natural materials, was prone to clumping, and the colors for the beautiful illuminations were ground from minerals, a messy and dusty process. The scribe was not just a writer, they were also a pen maker, a parchment preparer, and an ink maker, all rolled into one. The work itself was not creative but copyist. The vast majority of a scribe's time was spent not on composing new texts, but on copying old ones. They would work from a master text, often a damaged or faded document, and meticulously reproduce it. The goal was not to interpret or innovate, but to be as faithful to the original as possible. A single mistake could propagate for centuries, a silent error passed down from one generation of scribes to the next. The work was so monotonous that many scribes would leave little notes in the margins, known as marginalia, complaining of the cold, the boredom, or the pain in their fingers. These small, human touches are a quiet testament to the drudgery of their profession. The pace was slow, agonizingly so. A single page could take an entire day to complete. A full book, like a copy of the Bible, could take years. This was not a sprint, it was a marathon of focused labor, day after day, year after year. The scribe's life was one of endless repetition, a quiet, repetitive grind that lacked the excitement of a knight or the intellectual thrill of a great philosopher. Yet, their work was vital. They were the silent guardians of knowledge, the human photocopiers who, through their boring, painstaking work, preserved the great texts of the ancient world. But their very existence was also a kind of vulnerability. What would happen when their repetitive work began to produce mistakes, and how would these mundane errors slowly change the texts that formed the very foundation of Western civilization? The life of a medieval scribe was defined by its unyielding monotony, and this very monotony was its greatest weakness. The relentless repetition of copying text, often for hours in cold, poor light, inevitably led to errors. These were not deliberate mistakes, but the simple, unglamorous consequences of human fallibility. A scribe might skip a line, confuse two similar letters, or misspell a word due to fatigue. These errors were known as copyists' errors, and they were the silent saboteurs of medieval knowledge. One of the most common mistakes was homoeoarcton, same beginning, or homoeotolutin, same ending, where a scribe's eye would jump from one line to another that began or ended with a similar word or phrase. The result was an entire section of text being accidentally omitted. Another common problem was misreading the original manuscript. A faded or damaged letter could be misinterpreted, leading to a new word or phrase that was completely different from the original. This could slowly but surely alter the meaning of a text over multiple generations of copying. The work was also a battle against a more tangible foe, vermin. Scriptoriums, with their valuable parchment and bindings, were a constant target for rats and mice. A scribe might arrive in the morning to find a carefully crafted page nibbled by a rodent. The ink itself, made from various organic materials, could also attract insects, which would eat their way through the text. The constant battle against these forces of decay was a real and present danger to the preservation of knowledge. The lack of a centralized, uniform system for copying only compounded the problem. Each scriptorium had its own style, its own set of conventions, and its own level of rigor. A scribe in one monastery might be more meticulous than a scribe in another. There was no quality control, no peer review process to ensure the accuracy of a copy. This meant that the same text, copied in a dozen different monasteries, could exist in a dozen slightly different versions, each with its own unique set of errors. The seemingly innocent errors of the scribes had profound, long-term consequences. A mistake in a religious text could alter a theological point. A mistake in a medical text could change a remedy. A mistake in a legal text could alter a law. These small, mundane errors, accumulated over centuries, slowly corrupted the very foundations of Western thought. The beautiful, illuminated manuscripts we admire today are, in many cases, silent carriers of these long-forgotten clerical errors. But the scribes were also the silent heroes of a different kind. In an era when books were incredibly rare and precious, they were the ones who kept knowledge from disappearing entirely. They were the human hard drives of the Middle Ages. They not only copied religious texts but also the works of Roman and Greek philosophers, physicians, and mathematicians. Without their tedious, repetitive work, much of the classical heritage would have been lost to us forever. The irony is that the same process that preserved these texts also slowly corrupted them. The very act of saving knowledge from oblivion was also a process of quietly changing it. How would this slow, silent alteration of texts come to an end, and what invention would finally make the scribe's painstaking work obsolete, bringing an end to this unglamorous era of human copying? The end of the medieval scribe's era was not marked by a sudden, dramatic event, but by a quiet, unglamorous invention that changed everything: the printing press. The creation of movable type in the mid-15th century by Johannes Gutenberg made the painstaking, monotonous work of the scribe obsolete almost overnight. The printing press was not a more artistic tool, it was an industrial one, designed for speed and efficiency, and it killed the craft of manuscript copying with a mundane finality. The immediate impact was economic. A printer could produce hundreds of copies of a book in the time it took a scribe to produce one. This drove down the cost of books, making them accessible to a much wider audience than ever before. The scarcity that had defined the medieval book trade was gone. Knowledge, once a precious commodity hoarded in monastic libraries, was now an item that could be mass-produced and sold. For the first time, a merchant, a doctor, or a university student could own their own copies of essential texts without having to pay a fortune or spend a lifetime copying them. The printing press also solved the problem of copyists' errors. While a printer could still make a mistake, that mistake would be uniform across every single copy of a print run. Once a proofreader caught the error, it could be corrected in the next edition. This uniformity created a new standard of accuracy. Texts, for the first time in centuries, began to stabilize. The constant, slow corruption of texts was brought to a halt. The scribe's curse, the unintentional errors that had crept into the great works of antiquity, was finally broken. The mundane end of the scribe's life had profound, long-term consequences for society. The widespread availability of books fueled the Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation. The ability to mass-produce and distribute texts allowed new ideas to spread with unprecedented speed. Martin Luther's treatises, for example, were not painstakingly copied by monks, they were printed and distributed throughout Europe, reaching a wide audience in a matter of weeks. The printing press was not just a technological invention, it was a political and social one, a tool for revolutionizing how people thought and communicated. Ultimately, the story of the medieval scribe is a quiet, powerful reminder of the unsung heroes of history. We remember the grand thinkers and the great kings, but it was the boring, repetitive work of these copyists that preserved the very texts that define our civilization. Their lives, filled with the drudgery of cold rooms and endless writing, are a testament to how crucial the most unglamorous labor is to the march of human progress. The printing press, a purely logistical and administrative invention, was the final outcome of a long historical arc that began with the first monk in the first scriptorium, showing us that the most profound shifts in history often come from the most mundane of innovations. When we think of Napoleon's army, we imagine the thunder of cannons, the glint of bayonets, and the heroic charge of the Imperial Guard. We picture a well-oiled military machine, marching relentlessly across the face of Europe. But this grand, romantic image hides a far more mundane and brutal reality, the unglamorous, constant struggle to feed 250,000 men. The logistical challenge of a Napoleonic campaign was not a matter of strategy, it was a daily, soul-crushing battle for sustenance. The greatest enemy of a Napoleonic army was not the British or the Russians, it was hunger. The supply system of the Grande Armée was a logistical nightmare. It was built on a principle known as living off the land, a phrase that sounds simple but was, in practice, a recipe for chaos and suffering. An army of 250,000 men required a staggering amount of food per day. Each soldier needed around 2 pounds of bread, a pound of meat, and a pint of wine or beer. Add to that the grain for the thousands of horses, and the daily caloric requirement was in the millions. There was no way to carry this much food in a centralized supply chain. Wagons were slow, roads were often poor, and the sheer bulk of the provisions was insurmountable. So, the army was forced to forage. As the army marched, it would fan out across the countryside, and soldiers would requisition food from local farmers in villages. This system was not a coordinated, centralized process. It was a messy, decentralized free-for-all. A soldier, often starving, would break into a farmhouse, take whatever he could find, and move on. The official policy was to pay for the requisition goods with billets de requisition, IOUs issued by the French state. These were often worthless to the locals, leading to resentment and, at times, open rebellion. The practice of foraging had a number of serious, unglamorous consequences. First, it alienated the local population. The very people who might have welcomed the French as liberators saw them as a plague of locusts, stripping the land bare. This popular animosity led to guerrilla warfare and a general lack of cooperation, making the army's job even harder. Second, it was wildly inefficient. The food found in one area might be completely different from the next. A soldier might go for days without a proper meal, only to find a glut of a single item, like potatoes, in the next village. The nutritional balance of the troops was non-existent. The problem was compounded by the speed of the march. Napoleon believed in rapid, decisive maneuvers. An army could cover 30 miles in a day, but the slow, cumbersome supply train of wagons and pack animals could not keep up. The soldiers would arrive at a new location, exhausted and hungry, only to find that their supplies were still a day's march behind. This created a vicious cycle. The faster the army moved, the more desperate the foraging became, and the more the troops suffered. The soldiers were not just fighting a war, they were fighting a daily battle against their own stomachs, a struggle that was far more constant and draining than any single skirmish. What was the solution to this logistical nightmare, and what unexpected resource would Napoleon's engineers and quartermasters turn to in a desperate attempt to keep the army fed? The logistical nightmare of feeding the Grande Armée was a problem of scale, a Malthusian trap on the march. The army's growth outpaced its ability to feed itself through simple foraging. The constant hunger and malnutrition led to widespread disease and a high rate of desertion. Soldiers, tired of a diet of inconsistent, often spoiled food, would abandon the ranks in search of a better life. Napoleon, with his brilliant strategic mind, understood that his empire could not be built on an empty stomach. He turned to his engineers and administrators for a solution, and the answer came not from a new weapon, but from a new kind of food preservation. The solution was canning. The French government, in a desperate bid to solve the army's logistical problems, offered a prize for a new method of food preservation that would keep provisions fresh for long periods. The winner was a confectioner named Nicholas Appert. Appert's method was simple. He would place food in glass bottles, seal them with a cork and wax, and then boil the bottles in water. He didn't know why it worked. Louis Pasteur's work on bacteria was decades away, but he knew that the food inside would remain edible for months, if not years. Appert's invention was not a silver bullet. The process was slow and expensive. The glass bottles were fragile and heavy, making them difficult to transport on a campaign. They were far from a perfect solution, but they were a first step towards a new kind of supply system, one that didn't rely on the brutal inefficiency of foraging. The Napoleonic army began to experiment with canned provisions, and while it didn't solve the problem entirely, it was a crucial, if unglamorous, innovation. It allowed for the creation of small, mobile depots of food that could be distributed to the troops, providing a much-needed supplement to their often meager diet. The quartermasters and supply officers of the Grande Armée were the unsung heroes of this logistical battle. Their job was far from glamorous. It was a constant, grueling process of requisitioning, organizing, and distributing. They were the ones who had to haggle with local mayors, organize the chaotic flow of wagons, and ensure that every soldier, from the humblest private to the highest-ranking general, received their daily rations. Their work was not the stuff of glory, but it was the very thing that kept the army from disintegrating. The campaign into Russia in 1812 was the ultimate test of this fragile supply system, and it was a test the system failed spectacularly. The sheer size of the army, over 600,000 men, was a logistical impossibility. The living off the land strategy was a catastrophic failure. The Russian countryside was vast and sparsely populated. The Russian military, in a brilliant strategic move, practiced a scorched earth policy, burning crops and towns as they retreated. This left the French army with nothing to forage. The army, already stretched to the breaking point, was starving. The logistical nightmare became a slow-motion catastrophe. What would be the ultimate, bitter lesson learned from this failure, and how would this unglamorous tale of food and logistics shape military strategy for centuries to come? The retreat from Russia was a logistical catastrophe that sealed the fate of Napoleon's army. It was a slow-motion unraveling caused not by a single defeat on the battlefield, but by the relentless, unglamorous enemy of hunger and cold. The soldiers, already weak from inconsistent rations, were now faced with a landscape that offered no food. The living off the land strategy, once a source of speed and flexibility, had become a death sentence. The army was no longer a unified fighting force, it was a desperate, starving mob, leaving a trail of dead and dying men across the frozen plains. The logistical failure of the Russian campaign was a brutal, cold, and final lesson that no amount of military genius could overcome. The long-term legacy of this unglamorous disaster was a profound shift in military thought. The Napoleonic Wars, for all their romanticism, taught the world that logistics, not just strategy, wins wars. Future military planners, from the American Civil War to World War I, would obsess over supply lines, railroads, and food preservation. The great armies of the 19th and 20th centuries were not just built on courage and discipline, they were built on the boring, meticulous work of quartermasters, engineers, and supply officers. The concept of a modern, centralized supply chain, with its reliance on canned goods, railroads, and telegraphs, was a direct response to the failures of the Napoleonic era. The mundane story of a Napoleonic army's breakfast is a powerful counter-narrative to the romantic view of warfare. It shows that the true heroes and villains of history are often not the ones who make grand speeches or lead charges, but the ones who manage the unglamorous, everyday details of life. The fate of an empire, and the lives of hundreds of thousands of men, came down to a simple, unsolvable problem: how to get a piece of bread to a starving soldier in the middle of a vast and hostile wilderness. The answer, brutally learned, was that it was impossible. The logistical nightmare of the Grande Army's breakfast proved, once and for all, that an army truly does march on its stomach. When you think of ancient Rome, you might imagine the grandeur of the Colosseum, the power of the Senate, or the might of the legions. But the true foundation of Roman longevity wasn't built on stone and steel alone, it was built on a far more mundane and unglamorous obsession with public health and sanitation. The Roman state understood, in a way that few civilizations before them had, that the health of its citizens was paramount to the health of the empire. At the forefront of this effort was a small, quiet, and often overlooked group of officials, the aediles. The aediles were the city managers of ancient Rome. Their job was not to command armies or pass laws, but to manage the daily, unglamorous grind of urban life. They were responsible for maintaining public buildings, managing the grain supply, organizing public games, and, most importantly, overseeing the public health and sanitation of the city. Their work was a constant battle against filth, disease, and human negligence. It was a job that required a keen eye for detail and a stomach for the unpleasant realities of a large, bustling metropolis. The aediles were, in a very real sense, the world's first public health inspectors. Their job was to patrol the streets of Rome, ensuring that the public spaces were clean and orderly. They had the authority to impose fines on citizens who illegally dumped their waste in the street, who obstructed public walkways, or who allowed their property to fall into disrepair. They were the city's quiet guardians, the ones who ensured that a walk through the forum didn't end with a trip to the doctor. Their responsibilities were vast and varied. They had to inspect the public baths, ensuring that the water was clean and that the facilities were well maintained. The baths were more than just places to get clean, they were social hubs, and a disease outbreak in a bathhouse could spread throughout the city in a matter of days. The aediles had to work closely with the curators aquarum, the aqueduct managers, to ensure a constant supply of fresh water to the baths and the public fountains. The aediles also had to oversee the public markets, a chaotic, bustling place where food was bought and sold. They had to ensure that the produce was fresh, that the meat was safe to eat, and that the scales were accurate. This was a direct attempt to prevent foodborne illnesses, a constant threat in the ancient world. They had to be meticulous in their inspections, a boring, repetitive task that was essential to the health of the entire city. But the most difficult and unglamorous part of their job was the management of Rome's waste. The city was a giant, urban experiment, and its waste management system was a constant challenge. The aediles were responsible for maintaining the Cloaca Maxima, the city's great sewer system. This required a team of engineers and laborers to constantly inspect and repair the sewer, a dank and dangerous job that was far from heroic. The aediles also had to manage the collection of garbage, a decentralized and often messy affair. They would fine citizens for improper waste disposal, and their work was a constant, uphill battle against the sheer amount of refuse produced by the city's population. The aediles' work was a testament to the Roman obsession with order and cleanliness. They understood that these were not just aesthetic concerns, but matters of public safety and military readiness. A city full of sick citizens was a weak city, unable to fight a war or run an empire. Their work, though it lacked the glory of a military victory or the fame of a political triumph, was the true foundation of Roman resilience. But as the empire grew, so did the size of its cities and the complexity of its health problems. How would the aediles' small, local bureaucracy adapt to a growing, sprawling empire, and what happens when the mundane problems of public health become too big for a few officials to handle? As the Roman Empire grew, so too did its cities, and with this rapid urban sprawl, the mundane problems of public health became a monumental challenge. The aediles, once a small and effective force in the relatively contained city of early Rome, found their authority and resources stretched to the breaking point. The population of Rome swelled to over 1 million people, and the sheer volume of waste and the density of the populace created a constant, low-grade public health crisis. The aediles' small team of inspectors and laborers could no longer keep up with the demands of an ever-expanding metropolis. This was a problem of scalability. The solutions that worked for a small city-state, fining a few citizens for dumping waste, were woefully inadequate for a sprawling empire. The aediles were still responsible for the same duties, but now on a scale that was almost impossible to manage. The public fountains, once a reliable source of clean water, were now susceptible to contamination from leaky pipes and poor sanitation in the surrounding slums. The markets, now a central hub for goods from all over the empire, were a new vector for disease, as food from far-flung provinces could carry a variety of pathogens. The aediles, the city's humble guardians, were now faced with a problem of global proportions, a problem they were ill-equipped to handle. The ultimate test of their system came with the great plagues that ravaged the Roman world. The Antonine Plague in the 2nd century AD and the Plague of Cyprian in the 3rd century AD were not just military or political disasters, they were a catastrophic failure of the public health infrastructure. The aediles, with their limited staff and simple fines, were powerless to stop a pandemic that was spread by trade, troop movements, and the sheer density of urban life. The Roman obsession with cleanliness and order, which had been so effective in a more contained environment, proved to be no match for a global pandemic. In the face of these disasters, the aediles' role became more reactive than proactive. They were no longer preventing disease, they were simply trying to manage the dead. Their teams were tasked with the unglamorous job of collecting bodies, a task that was as dangerous as it was gruesome. The meticulous work of inspecting markets and cleaning sewers gave way to the grim reality of burying the dead and trying to contain the spread of a disease they did not understand. The system that had been built on a foundation of order and control was now overwhelmed by chaos and death. The failure of the aediles to contain the great plagues was not a failure of their intent, but a failure of their system's scale. Their A-for-a-problem approach, one inspector for one section, one fine for one offense, could not cope with a problem that was 100 times bigger. The plagues exposed a fundamental vulnerability in the Roman system, its reliance on a localized, low-tech bureaucracy to manage a globalized, complex problem. The aediles were the quiet, forgotten victims of this crisis, their unglamorous mission rendered impossible by the very success of the empire they had helped to build. What happened to the aediles and their system after the plagues, and how did this unglamorous fight against disease and waste forever change the relationship between a city and its citizens? The great plagues of the Roman Empire were a turning point, not just for Roman public health but for the very idea of it. The aedile system, built on a foundation of local inspections and fines, was shown to be tragically insufficient for a globalized world. The plagues, which killed a third of the empire's population, taught the Romans a bitter lesson, that health was not just a local problem, but a systemic one. The response to this crisis, though slow and uneven, was a shift in focus from individual sanitation to a more centralized, and more military-like, approach to public health. The mundane, unglamorous work of the aediles was subsumed by a larger, more coordinated effort. In the centuries that followed, the role of public health would evolve, but its foundational principles, the importance of clean water, proper waste disposal, and food safety, would remain. The aedile's failure was a lesson learned by generations of urban planners and administrators. The Roman obsession with order and cleanliness, so meticulously carried out by the aediles, became a model for cities long after the fall of the empire. The very concept of a public health official, of a civil servant tasked with the boring but vital job of keeping a city healthy, has its roots in the aediles and their unglamorous mission. The story of the aediles is a testament to the idea that the silent, unsung battles of history are often the most important. We remember the grand battles and the great emperors, but the true foundation of Roman longevity was in the mundane, thankless work of a handful of officials who fought a daily war against filth and disease. Their efforts, though often invisible, were the true force behind the city's longevity. The Roman obsession with public health, a legacy of the aediles' meticulous work, would be forgotten for centuries after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, only to be rediscovered during the Great Plagues of the Middle Ages. The lessons learned in ancient Rome were hard-won and brutally taught, and they continue to resonate today, reminding us that the health of a society is built on the most unglamorous of foundations. When we think of the Medici family, we think of patronage, art, and the glittering world of the Italian Renaissance. We picture magnificent palaces, commissions for masterpieces by artists like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, and a dynasty that ruled Florence with a quiet but firm hand. But the true secret to the Medici's power was not in their taste for art or their political cunning, it was in their meticulous, unglamorous financial records. The art they funded and the dynasty they built were all made possible by a rigorous, boring, and utterly revolutionary system of accounting. The story of the Medici begins not with a prince, but with a banker. The family's rise to power was founded on the success of their banking enterprise, the Medici Bank. Founded by Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici in 1397, the bank was an incredibly complex and decentralized organization. It had branches in major European cities like Rome, Venice, Bruges, and London. Managing a financial empire of this scale, across vast distances in different currencies, required a system of record-keeping that was far more advanced than anything that had come before. The Medici's innovation was their mastery of double-entry bookkeeping. While the concept wasn't entirely new, it had been used in a rudimentary form by merchants in Italy for some time. The Medici perfected it and used it on a scale that was unprecedented. Double-entry bookkeeping meant that every financial transaction was recorded in at least two places, a debit and a credit. For every deposit, there was a corresponding entry noting where the money came from. For every loan, there was a corresponding entry noting who owed the money. This created a complete, transparent, and accurate picture of the bank's finances. It was the ancient world's equivalent of a digital spreadsheet, a silent, powerful tool for managing a complex business. The chief accountants and clerks of the Medici Bank were the unsung heroes of this financial revolution. Their work was not to deal with kings or popes, but to sit in cold, silent rooms, poring over vast ledgers. Their tools were a simple quill pen, a pot of ink, and a meticulous attention to detail. A single misplaced digit or a forgotten entry could throw the entire system into chaos. Their life was one of repetitive, soul-crushing accuracy, but it was their work that allowed the Medici to know, at any given moment, the exact state of their finances. This gave them an immense advantage over their competitors. They knew who owed them money, who they owed money to, and how much capital they had on hand to invest in new ventures, from wool production to a marble quarry. The meticulous records also allowed them to manage the complexities of international finance. The Medici Bank dealt in multiple currencies, and the records had to track the fluctuating exchange rates between Florence's florin, Venice's ducat, and other currencies. This was a sophisticated, mathematical problem that the Medici's accountants solved on a daily basis, their work a silent testament to the unglamorous power of numbers. But the Medici's financial records were not just about money, they were about power. The detailed ledgers allowed the Medici to keep a close eye on their clients, many of whom were kings, popes, and powerful noblemen. The records were a silent, constant record of who owed them money. This financial leverage gave the Medici immense political influence. They could use their control of a king's debt to influence his policies, or a pope's debt to secure a lucrative contract. The Medici's power was not just in their name, it was in the pages of their ledgers. But the very system that gave them so much power also made them vulnerable. What would happen when this complex web of ledgers and loans became too vast to manage, and how would the meticulous records that built an empire also become the source of its unglamorous downfall? The Medici's financial empire, for all its meticulous record-keeping, was a victim of its own success. As the bank grew, its decentralized structure became a source of immense vulnerability. The various branches, from Bruges to Rome, operated with a significant degree of autonomy. While the accountants in Florence attempted to keep a unified ledger, the sheer volume and complexity of the transactions made it impossible to have a real-time, accurate picture of the bank's entire financial state. This created a new kind of risk, one that the Medici's boring, paper-based system could not address: the risk of remote fraud and mismanagement. A branch manager in London, for instance, could make risky loans or engage in fraudulent activities that would not be discovered by the head office in Florence for months, if not a year. The communication was slow, relying on couriers who had to travel across a continent plagued by war and political instability. By the time a report reached Florence, the damage might already be done. This was the dark side of the Medici's global reach. Their books, for all their accuracy, were always a look at the past, not a reflection of the present. The Medici's downfall was not a dramatic collapse, but a slow, unglamorous process of bad debt. The very system that had given them power, lending money to popes and kings, became their undoing. The clients, many of whom were in constant states of war or political turmoil, were not reliable borrowers. Kings would default on their loans, and the debt would be written off, a quiet line item in a ledger that represented a devastating financial loss. A single bad loan to a king could wipe out the profits of an entire branch for years. The Medici's accountants would dutifully record these losses, but they were powerless to prevent them. The final blow came in the late 15th century, when the French King Charles VIII invaded Italy. The invasion plunged the Italian peninsula into chaos and caused a series of political and financial crises. The Medici's debtors, facing their own problems, defaulted on their loans en masse. The bank's cash flow, which was the lifeblood of its operations, dried up. The meticulous ledgers, once a symbol of the bank's immense wealth, were now a silent, damning record of its insolvency. The Medici, for all their power and influence, could not simply demand payment from a bankrupt king or a city in turmoil. The story of the Medici's financial decline is a powerful lesson in the limitations of bureaucracy and record-keeping. Their system of double-entry bookkeeping was a marvel of its time, but it could not account for the human and political factors that were beyond its control. The accountants, for all their skill, could not prevent a king from going to war or a pope from defaulting on his debts. The Medici's vast and complex financial empire, which had been built on a foundation of boring, meticulous records, ultimately crumbled under the weight of an unrecordable truth, that the world, for all its systems and ledgers, is often a chaotic and unpredictable place. What happened to the Medici family's financial legacy after the collapse of their bank, and how did their obsession with accounting forever change the world of finance? The collapse of the Medici Bank was a devastating blow to the family's financial power, but their legacy outlived their banking empire. The Medici did not disappear from history. Instead, they leveraged the political influence they had gained from their financial leverage to transition from bankers to rulers. Their meticulous financial records, which had so accurately charted their rise, now served as a testament to the risks of a system they had perfected. The long-term impact of their work was not the dynasty they founded, but the financial principles they codified. The Medici's greatest legacy was the institutionalization of double-entry bookkeeping. While other merchants and bankers had used it, the Medici's global-scale application of the system made it the gold standard for commerce. Their comprehensive, organized ledgers became the model for future financial enterprises. This unglamorous tool of management would eventually be adopted throughout Europe, becoming the foundation of modern accounting and finance. It allowed for a new level of financial transparency and control, making it possible to manage large, complex businesses in a way that had never been possible before. The Medici's reliance on detailed records also introduced the modern world to the concept of risk management. While their system ultimately failed to account for political instability, it forced them to constantly assess the financial health of their debtors. The ledgers were a tool for quantifying risk, of measuring the likelihood of a loan being repaid. This was a revolutionary concept, and it laid the groundwork for the complex risk models used by financial institutions today. The accountants, hunched over their ledgers, were not just recording history, they were, in their own quiet way, predicting the future. Ultimately, the story of the Medici's financial records teaches us a crucial lesson: that power is often built on the most mundane of foundations. The grand art and political intrigue of the Renaissance were all financed by the silent, relentless work of accountants and clerks. The boring, meticulous details of debits and credits were more powerful than a knight's sword or a king's crown. The fall of the Medici Bank was a brutal reminder that a complex system, no matter how well documented, is still vulnerable to the chaos of the real world. But the system itself, the beautiful, logical structure of the ledger, was a lasting contribution that would forever change the way we do business, showing us that the most lasting innovations are often the ones we see the least. When we think of the Byzantine Empire, we often think of its grand cathedrals, its sophisticated mosaics, and its formidable walls. We imagine a state built on the twin pillars of Roman military tradition and Greek Orthodox faith. But the true foundation of Byzantine power, the unglamorous and enduring force that kept the empire afloat for 1,000 years, was its tax code. The Byzantine state was a bureaucratic marvel, a system that managed to extract wealth from a vast, diverse, and often hostile population with a quiet, persistent efficiency. The empire's strength was not in its glorious victories, but in its ability to count, to record, and to collect. At the heart of this system was the Dionysus, a 15-year tax cycle that governed the empire's financial life. Every 15 years, a census was conducted. Meticulous records were kept of every single plot of land, every house, and every person. The officials, known as clericoi, were not glorified heroes, they were dry, meticulous accountants who went from village to village, counting every head of livestock, measuring every field, and assessing every building. Their job was to create a comprehensive and accurate record of the empire's wealth, a detailed spreadsheet of its assets. This record, known as the Tacticon, was the very lifeblood of the Byzantine state. The purpose of this census was not just to count people, but to determine the tax burden for each village. The taxes were not just in gold, they were often in kind, in grain, in wine, or in olive oil. This system was designed for an agrarian economy, where the wealth of a region was directly tied to its agricultural output. The grain collected in Egypt could be used to feed the armies in Anatolia. The wine from Greece could be used to pay for a public works project in Constantinople. The Byzantine tax system was not just about money, it was about the logistical management of an entire continent's resources. The clericoi's work was essential, but it was also a source of constant friction. A farmer, knowing that his tax burden for the next 15 years would be based on the census, might try to hide some of his livestock or underreport the size of his field. The clericoi, for their part, were trained to spot these deceptions. They were the empire's quiet enforcers, the ones who ensured that every citizen, from the humblest peasant to the wealthiest noble, contributed their fair share. Their work was the very thing that made the Byzantine state strong and resilient, allowing it to withstand wars and political turmoil that would have destroyed a lesser empire. But the system, for all its meticulousness, was also a source of its own quiet, unglamorous problems. The tax burden, once set, was unchangeable for 15 years. This was a source of stability, but also a source of profound injustice. What happened when a plague wiped out a village's population, or a flood destroyed its fields? The villagers would still be expected to pay the same tax burden they had agreed to in the census. This created a new kind of quiet crisis, one that the Byzantine tax code, for all its meticulous detail, was not prepared to handle. What would happen when this rigid system came into conflict with the unpredictable chaos of the real world, and how would these mundane flaws begin to fray the very fabric of the empire? The silent crisis created by the inflexible Byzantine tax code was not a sudden, dramatic cause of the empire's fall, but a persistent, unglamorous factor that contributed to its long, slow decline. The tacticon, once a source of strength, had become a source of profound weakness. The constant flight of the rural population to the cities created a demographic shift that the empire was ill-equipped to handle. The tax base, which had been the foundation of the state, was eroding, and the great cities, once centers of commerce, were now overcrowded with the landless poor. The very system that had been designed to provide stability was, in a quiet and unglamorous way, destabilizing the empire from within. The Byzantine Empire did not fall because of a single bad tax policy, but the unintended consequences of the tax code certainly weakened it. The constant friction between the people and the state created a deep sense of alienation, and it made the people more susceptible to the appeals of charismatic leaders or foreign powers. The Byzantine state, for all its power, had lost the trust of its most fundamental constituency, the common person. The system, once a source of order, had become a source of injustice, and this injustice was felt in the most mundane and personal way, in the unfair burden of a tax on a dead neighbor's land. The legacy of the Byzantine tax code is not in its success, but in its failure. It is a powerful lesson in the importance of flexibility and humanity in a system of government. It shows us that a bureaucracy, no matter how meticulous and well-intentioned, can become a source of tyranny and oppression if it is not able to adapt to the unpredictable realities of human life. The story of the Byzantine tax code, and the silent crisis it created, is a testament to the idea that the most important lessons of history are often found not in the great battles, but in the small, unglamorous details of daily life, in the pages of a census, in the quiet desperation of a farmer. When we think of the Dutch East India Company, VOC, we often picture a fleet of magnificent sailing ships, laden with spices from the far-flung islands of Indonesia. We envision a commercial powerhouse that established the world's first multinational corporation, built a vast colonial empire, and revolutionized global trade. But the true engine of the VOC's power was not its ships or its cannons, it was its paperwork. The company was an administrative machine of unprecedented scale, and its success was built on a mountain of ledgers, manifests, letters, and reports. The VOC's greatest challenge was not sailing across the ocean, but the unglamorous, constant struggle to manage a global empire on paper. The story begins in the bustling port of Amsterdam, where the VOC's headquarters, the Oostindische Huis, hummed with activity. This was not a place of swashbuckling adventure, but a center of meticulous, boring administration. Thousands of clerks, scribes, and accountants worked in a hive of controlled chaos, their days filled with the repetitive grind of data entry. They were the silent, unseen heroes of the Dutch Golden Age, and their job was to create a system that could manage a global enterprise that stretched from the Netherlands to Japan. The core of this system was the bookkeeping. The VOC was the first company to perfect a system of accounting that could track and manage complex, long-distance trade. Every single piece of cargo, from a peppercorn to a bale of cloth, was meticulously recorded in a series of ledgers. There were ledgers for the goods purchased in Asia, ledgers for the goods sold in Europe, ledgers for the wages paid to sailors, and ledgers for the company's vast expenses, from the cost of a new ship to the price of a single nail. This system, though tedious and repetitive, was the bedrock of the company's financial success. It allowed the directors in Amsterdam to know, at any given moment, the exact state of their finances, and to make rational, data-driven decisions about where to invest their capital. The logistical challenge was immense. A single ship, a flight, could carry hundreds of tons of cargo. The manifests for these ships were complex, multi-page documents that had to be copied by hand, and every discrepancy, no matter how small, had to be noted. A clerk who made a mistake could cost the company thousands of guilders. The pressure to be accurate was intense, and the working conditions were often poor. Scribes would work for hours in cold, dimly lit rooms, their hands cramping from the endless writing, but their work was essential. The communication system was just as complex as the financial one. Letters and reports, known as dispatches, would travel between the directors in Amsterdam and the company's various outposts in places like Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, and the Cape of Good Hope. These dispatches were not just a simple exchange of letters, they were a flood of information. A single dispatch might contain a detailed report on the local political situation in Ceylon, a financial summary of the past year's trade, and a request for new supplies. These documents were the lifeblood of the company, and they were the only way the directors could maintain control over their far-flung empire. But the sheer volume of paperwork was a problem in itself. The Oostindische Huis was a veritable ocean of paper. Reports and ledgers would pile up, and the process of sifting through this mountain of information was a constant, unglamorous battle. The VOC's administrators had to devise a system of filing and retrieval that was as efficient as their ships. They created detailed indexes and cross-referenced reports to ensure that a piece of information, no matter how old, could be found when it was needed. This was the world's first big data problem, and the Dutch solved it with a simple, boring technology, the organized filing cabinet. The VOC's system of paperwork was a testament to the idea that a global empire could be built not on glory and conquest alone, but on the unglamorous, relentless grind of administration. But this very system, so vital to their success, was also a source of vulnerability. What would happen when a dispatch was lost at sea, or a ledger was damaged in a fire? How could a company manage an empire in which the very information that made it run was so fragile, and how would this logistical problem ultimately contribute to the company's long, slow decline? The Dutch East India Company's reliance on paperwork was its greatest strength and its most profound vulnerability. The vast ocean that their ships traversed was mirrored by an equally vast paper ocean in their offices in Amsterdam and Batavia. The very act of managing this administrative sea was a constant, unglamorous battle against logistical chaos. The central problem was delay. The time it took for a ship to sail from Batavia to Amsterdam and back was a year, sometimes more. This meant that the information in a report was always months out of date. The directors in Amsterdam would be making decisions based on data that was up to 2 years old, a kind of historical accounting that made it impossible to respond to a rapidly changing market. This time lag created a new kind of risk. A branch manager in Batavia might make a decision based on local information, only to find out months later that the market in Europe had changed and the goods they had purchased were now worthless. The communication from the directors in Amsterdam, likewise, would arrive months after it was relevant. Orders for new goods, requests for more capital, and changes in company policy would often be received and read long after the window of opportunity had closed. The dispatches, the very lifeblood of the company, were not a real-time communication system, they were a slow, ponderous exchange of historical documents. The fragility of the paperwork itself was another constant source of anxiety. A single shipwreck could sink a year's worth of records, leaving the directors in Amsterdam with a gaping hole in their financial data. A fire in a colonial outpost could destroy a ledger that contained the only record of a massive debt or a crucial contract. The very physical nature of their record-keeping system, with its reliance on ink and paper, made it susceptible to the forces of nature. The scribes and clerks who copied and managed these documents were, in a very real sense, the custodians of the company's history, and a single mistake or a single act of God could erase a significant piece of that history. This logistical chaos had real, human consequences. The unreliability of the communication system often led to misunderstandings and conflicts between the directors in Amsterdam and the administrators in the colonies. A director might accuse a colonial administrator of mismanagement, not knowing that a crucial report explaining the situation had been lost at sea. A colonial administrator might go against an order from Amsterdam, believing it to be a mistake, only to find out months later that a new order had been sent but had not yet arrived. The constant, unglamorous friction of poor communication was a source of immense stress and political infighting, and it was a direct result of the company's paperwork problem. The solution to this problem was a simple, boring one: redundancy. The VOC would send multiple copies of important documents on different ships, hoping that at least one of them would make it to its destination. This was an expensive and time-consuming process, but it was the only way to mitigate the risk of a lost document. The scribes would spend countless hours meticulously copying and recopying the same documents, their lives a testament to the unglamorous reality of risk management. The story of the Dutch East India Company is a powerful reminder that even the most innovative of empires is built on the most mundane of foundations. The company that conquered the world's oceans was, in its heart, a prisoner of its own paperwork, a massive, brilliant enterprise that was constantly fighting a war against the slow, silent forces of time and decay. What was the ultimate, unglamorous fate of the Dutch East India Company, and how did its paperwork problem contribute to its slow, inevitable decline? The final, unglamorous fate of the Dutch East India Company was not a sudden collapse, but a slow, agonizing process of administrative decay. Its paperwork problem, once a manageable inconvenience, became a fundamental cause of its decline. The company grew so large, and its administrative machine so vast and unwieldy, that it could no longer effectively manage its own affairs. The sheer volume of ledgers, reports, and manifests became an insurmountable burden. The directors in Amsterdam, buried under a mountain of paper, lost the ability to make timely and effective decisions. The empire was not failing from a lack of profit, it was failing from an inability to count and manage it. The company's bureaucracy became a drain on its resources. It cost an immense amount of money to pay the thousands of clerks, to buy the paper, and to transport the endless stream of documents across the world. The very system that had made the company so successful was now eating away at its profits. Corruption, once a minor nuisance, became rampant. Without a centralized, real-time system of accountability, local administrators in the colonies could embezzle funds and engage in illegal private trade with impunity. The paper records, once a source of transparency, were now a tool for deception. A crafty colonial official could falsify a ledger, and it would be months, if not years, before the fraud was discovered in Amsterdam, if it was discovered at all. The long, slow decline of the Dutch East India Company is a powerful historical lesson in the limits of bureaucracy. It shows that even the most innovative and powerful of human organizations can be brought down by a failure of administration. The company was not defeated by a rival navy or a popular uprising. It was defeated by its own ledgers, by the endless stream of paper that it could no longer manage. The story of the VOC is a testament to the idea that the silent, unglamorous details of daily life, the act of writing in a ledger, the meticulousness of a clerk, the speed of a courier ship, are as important to the course of history as any battle or treaty. The empire was not toppled by a sword, but by a mountain of unfiled reports, showing us that the most powerful of forces, in the end, are often the most mundane.